everybody, Taylor here with Mark Orr, and today we are tackling part 2 on the Mission Critical podcast of our mission statement. So the mission statement we have is helping catalytic leaders tackle big systemic problems together in community. Now that can sound like a pretty complex statement, and there are 3 parts of that statement that we want to take some time to focus on. The first one that we did last time is catalytic, and we talked about catalytic leaders and what they are and all different parts of that. Today, we're going to tackle systemic, what that means, and maybe even how you can engage in systemic problems. And then on our next podcast, we're going to tackle what it means to be together in community. So I'm here with Mark today, and he is going to tell us a little bit about systemic problems. So Mark, why don't you give us a bit of an introduction? What is a systemic problem?
Thanks, Taylor. I think it's good for our listeners to remember that everything L5 does is catalytic in general. We're not trying to be sort of like detail experts in every aspect of our subject. What we're trying to do is really be an organization that has the courage to ask questions and follow through with people as they start to explore things at a whole new level and at a whole new depth. So we feel like in general in the world, there's a lot of conversations that we're either deliberately or unknowingly avoiding and we need to tackle. So that's why we get into some of these things that maybe don't sound like everyday conversation, but maybe should be. Sometimes the language we use is a little bit we feel it's a very good word, but it's not a common word that you can easily use on the street. So we invite you to find new language for this. But as you listen here today, and any podcast that we do, try to understand the essence of what we're saying, and then we'd love you even to write back or share with us new ways that you've discovered to do this. So today we're talking about systemic issues or systemic problems, and we're calling people to look at the issues that they're trying to face, the issues, whether that's as a leader or as a donor or as a prayer person, and look at them in a way that's closer to reality. We all know that there's things that are on the surface and things that are underneath the skin. And often the things that are underneath, the internal things that are not visible initially, are actually the more important things, right? It's what comes out of us that is important, not what's outside of us, but it's the source of things is important. So when we go to a doctor and we're sick, and the doctor says, "Wow, you have a really severe disease, but let me give you some aspirin, or some painkillers, and that should help you through the next few days." And you look at the doctor and says, "You just said it was really serious. There's something really wrong with me inside." He said,
Right.
No, this is going to help you. And so you follow his advice and you take the pills and you do feel a bit better. But 5 days later, maybe 3 days later, you're back again in the office because the root has not been dealt with, right? And most of us, that makes sense to us, right? We say the doctor should treat the root issue, not just the symptom. Nothing wrong with treating the symptom to some degree, to alleviate the process, but that's only to alleviate it, to buy us time so that we can deal with the root issue. Okay. And that's, I think, a principle that relates in almost every aspect of life, whether it's your theology or the message of the gospel, or how we're going to deal with hunger or poverty. We need to be asking that question: what is really going on behind the scenes? And if we really want to be wise about how we invest in that problem, God has called us to respond to that problem, we must ask the questions that lead us to understand what the root of the problem actually is. So we call that systemic approach. Why do we call it a systemic approach? Why don't we just call it the root of the problem? Well, the two terms are related to each other. The root of the problem is the beginning. It's the source of that problem. But most likely, when you look at the root of the problem, it's not just one problem. It's a whole interrelated sort of, a maze of related problems that need to be dealt with and sort of untangled in order for us to actually start to wrestle with it, so that the original problem that got our attention is actually dealt with once and for all. So when we go to the root of the problem, we are going to discover a systemic problem. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Um, yeah, I've been actually watching one of those doctor shows on TV lately, and I'm trying to picture your example in the midst of that. You know, you don't see a doctor walk in a room and then make that kind of statement. You know, we're going to give you aspirin. You know, we'll give you something, and then walk away. You see them kind of maybe try and tackle the short-term problem so the person's not in pain in that moment, but then you watch them go away and go into a boardroom and sit down and try and think of the solution. What is the root of the problem? What is actually going on, and how can we wrestle with it? So great example. And it's so funny that we're the kind of people that or I guess most people are the type of people that would think that that's normal in a medical world, but yet sometimes we go about our lives and don't address that on in when we face other
Mhm.
issues. um, my question is kind of what keeps us from doing that? What would keep most people from taking the time to actually try and think on a systemic level? What prevents that in us?
Yeah, I mean it's the very short answer is that it's really hard to do that. And so the natural, human nature is that we want to avoid it. And so there's a number of things that happen there. In our own being, we see the problem, we don't understand it, and maybe we don't have the commitment, or we don't have the tools or the experience or the knowledge of how to ask the questions to go to the root of it. Excuse me. And so what we do is we want to help in some way. So we think, well, at least we can help with the symptom. And so we stop thinking and look for a way. And helping with the symptom feels pretty nice. It's easier to understand. It's visible. And what's more is, not only can I see the problem, at least from a surface perspective, and do something about it, it's the people that receive the help from me also feel it quickly. And so they're thankful. And then my friends see what I did, and it becomes a bit of a pride thing, is, hey, I'm helping this kid in Africa, because he's hungry. So I'm paying for him to have, 3 meals a day at school. And here's a picture of him smiling. And so we feel good about it. And you can see how that whole system feeds off itself. And the other, maybe some other reasons, is beyond the sort of the quick results and the gratification, is we want things that we can sort of wrap up quickly. That's sort of related to the short term, but we like to sort of come to a conclusion. And I think in today's world, where everything happens quickly, emails go at the speed of light, um, and we can travel in a few hours to any corner of the earth and so on. We like to have these little packages that we wrap up and conclude and then put away. And so it helps us avoid thinking along the longer time frames, because those get complicated. Um, Donors often like to give to one project that comes to a conclusion, rather than committing to a long-term project where they have to give maybe multiple times, and the risk is higher, and they don't know really where it's going to go. And so these are some of the challenges that push everybody to think, well, at least we're doing something. So we hide behind that, at least we're doing something thing. The other thing I've heard often, I'm just using the analogy of supporting kids. I mean, who doesn't want to help children, right? I mean, God loves children. We love children. Everybody loves children, and we feel compassion. We want to help children. The problem there is that we respond to the immediate feedback from the children, and we fail to actually dig deep into what's going to help them in the longer term. So it becomes sort of a very complicated thing. And then the other thing that starts to happen is, as we do this from month to month, year to year, even century to century, addressing the symptoms, we start to create structures, actually frameworks, systems, traditions that are built around these practices. And we forget what the original problem was, but we have this system. This is the way we do things, and we continue um, to do it without asking. And so then, when we come to start to ask the deeper issue, what is the root issue behind this? We find ourselves sort of trapped. We're trapped in a system that has sort of ossified around us. It's become rigid. And when we want to get back to addressing the root issue, we've actually created more problems than we've solved. Um, and so that's where this really sort of nasty word that a lot of people don't like, but at some level, I think is essential, is this word deconstruction. And we don't mean deconstructing the beautiful, wonderful, timeless things that God, the Alpha and the Omega, have given us in Scripture. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the things that come after that, when we start to create things that are made by man. And those things at some point um, need to be pulled down if they have been raised up against what God is wanting. A more friendly, sort of nicer word would be reimagining. And I like that word because I just love the whole process of dreaming and reimagining based on principles and God's Spirit just letting us see in His time frame um, what it is that He has in mind for us. The problem, though, is that invariably when you start to reimagine things, you realize that we've built things that don't fit that reimagining, and then we have to have the courage to take it apart. So use whatever word you like best, but at some point those structures need to come down, and those structures you will find probably represent part of the systemic problem, right? And that's why some of these systemic sort of constructions that we've put up um, are actually structures that we've become dependent on. Okay. Maybe our livelihood, maybe our jobs depend on an organization that was set up to solve a problem, but is doing it at a superficial level. And so we feel like our employer actually shouldn't exist or should completely change what they are. Well, that threatens my job. So now I'm stuck in a system that I'm perpetuating because I'm dependent on it. Um, to deal with that, that takes a ton of courage. And so these are some of the reasons why we avoid it. We avoid systemic change because it can hurt ourselves, it can hurt our friends, it can hurt our community in the short term. But we need to think at some point about what the long term changes are for the sake of far more people that can be blessed and benefit through it.
Wow. That kind of even sheds a new light on it for me. I hadn't really thought, I mean, I guess I'd thought about it, but there are so many people who are stuck in the midst of it, and maybe even recognize the systemic problem, but because of the position they're in, it's really hard to engage in systemic change because it will not just dismantle or cause them to reimagine or reconstruct the issue, but they pretty much may have to dismantle their life in order to make a way through it. So that is it's not for the faint of heart to think systemically. Definitely. Yeah, you gave us the example of working with children and feeling good and all of that. And of course, we can probably list dozens of examples
Yeah.
of ways that kind of just doing the surface level feel good thing. Um, we're just not getting to the root of the problem. Um, but can you take us a little bit deeper? You say in the blog post that it's actually quite harmful. Of course, it's harmful in the sense that we're removing resources from systemic problems. But do you have anything else you want to add just to the idea that actually just tackling the surface is harmful, and can just cause further damage?
Yeah. There's a couple of angles on that. I'm sure there's more that we could cover in a longer blog or a longer podcast. But one is, I think, just mentally. it inoculates us. We feel like we've done it. We've done something. So we need to stop thinking about it. And there's no more attention left to give to the problem. We've done our part and we walk away. And so rather than saying, wait a minute, let's really think through this and act when we understand it, we do something very quickly. And it's sort of like appeasing our guilt, right? Once our guilt is taken care of, then we don't really have to do anything about it. And so we're driven like that. And it leads to waste in the sense of entire projects and perhaps even organizations for a lifetime doing things that don't really add up to much. So that's one angle on it. The other is that we expend resources that could and probably should be used to address the systemic level. Okay. I would say that the vast amount of resources that we expend in the world today in tackling issues as Christians, good causes, whatever, and I'm talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars every single year. The vast majority of that money is being spent on the symptoms. Okay. Now imagine if we actually repurposed those monies to something else. Now, some of that money needs to be spent on symptoms. So, if a child is hungry, you don't say, okay, let's take a few weeks to, you know, we don't say, let's take a few weeks to, study the problem. Of course, we have to step in. That's an emergency, right? So I'm not saying that we don't do that. But we need to stop and say, okay, what can we do as on an emergency level right now to help? But let's take the time to actually invest in this. The problem is, though, that there's not a lot of money left over to do the long-term work, and it's not just about the money. It's the time. It's the mental capacity to focus on the long-term issues. We use that up, being inoculated, doing responses to short-term issues. I'll just give you a bit of an example. It's an exercise that we do in our leadership training. And it really comes down to math. If any of you are involved in investing or, putting your money in places where it makes more money and so on, you understand the importance of the interest rate or, the percentage of profits and so on. What's your turnover and how much money you're making for every $1,000 you're investing, right? That's really important. The mentality we have today in working on the short term is that you make some money. Let's say your $1,000 makes $100. Then you take that $100 and you eat it, right? You buy food or you go to the movies or you do something like that. And then your $1,000 can make another $100 and then you eat that $100, right? You keep investing, but you're eating up the profits. Okay. So that's short-term thinking. Okay. It's sort of subsistence living. And many people are stuck in that. But the problem is even smart people who in their businesses do it a much better way when it comes to good causes and Christian projects and so on, do it the old way. They actually violate their own principles and they don't actually invest in projects that have exponential possibilities. They don't know how to do that. So it always fascinates me how the skills we use in one sphere of our life don't always translate to another sphere. But the exercise we do is called the paper folding exercise. There's a few books out there that have popularized this as well. But if you take a piece of paper and you get a team doing this and you just fold it in half, and then you take that half folded paper and you fold it in half again, pretty much anywhere in the world you do that exercise, the maximum number of folds you'll get is 7. You can try it at home after this podcast. You'll get 7 folds. Okay. So just to round it off, it's about 1 centimeter thick. Okay. So let's say that we wanted to go to the sun. Okay. And we were going to build a pile of papers that would stacked on top of each other help us climb up to the sun. Okay. So we fold this paper and we create a little block of 1 centimeter thick. And then we get another piece of paper and we fold the block and get it another centimeter. And then we get another one. And we do that over and over and over and over again until we have a pile that reaches the sun. Okay. I think it's something like 50 million kilometers to the sun. Well, you can see how futile that would be, obviously, right? But we're just using it as an exercise. So that's treating the symptom. That's what we do. We keep trying to sort of have the same problem stacked up as individual blocks that we're trying to build. Whereas if you took a piece of paper, and I know this is hypothetical, but if you took a piece of paper that you could potentially fold an unlimited number of times, okay, so you take the paper that you folded 7 times, but we have this imaginary paper that can actually continue to be folded. How many times would we need to fold it to reach the sun? And there's very few groups, even groups that have math people and very smart people in the room, actually get this. And so they'll usually say, "Well, it's okay. It'll reach the roof. It's how about 1 meter or whatever." It's all. Most of the answers are inside the building, right? And so you stop and say, "Okay, what actually would happen is all you need to do is fold it 50 times." That's all you need to do is fold it 50 times. You've already folded it 7 times. Just keep going. Fold it 50 times, and you'll have a piece of paper that is 50 million kilometers thick. Okay.
I'm in disbelief.
You're in disbelief. Well, go try it. I mean, you can't try it all the way to the sun, obviously. It's just math. It's just multiplying by 2. It's doubling. Okay. That's all it is. It's 100% interest rate. If you had 100% interest rate, for 50 years, what would it be? You'd have this massive amount of money. So when we invest in the symptom, we were in this paper folding exercise, doing it over and over and over again with new pieces of paper. Okay. Same inputs. The effort is the same. But when we find a piece of paper that we can start with the same folds, but it's one that continues to grow exponentially, you have the same inputs, but far, far greater outputs. And one of the keys in the real world of transforming the world and good causes and tackling issues that we want to do, that's the difference between the symptom and the system. The system, addressing the system, is the mathematical, so to speak, mathematical key to having that same experience, that same exponential experience. Now, it takes some work to discover it. What is that formula, that approach? And we're not going to arrive at that unless we get down to the root of the problem. Okay, that's enough math for today.
Yeah, no, I think I'm understanding it now. It's like it's obviously it's can't even talk. It's an exponential graph, right? It just keeps going and going once it gets from 7 to 50. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm gonna bring back the math again. I have to for my next question a little bit. I've heard you talk about something before called the 5 whys. And I found this really effective because I think it's a great way to dig deeper. Could you walk us through what in the world are the 5 whys and what does it do?
Yeah, I don't think that's math. That's just a list of 5 things. But
maybe it's math or some of us.
One thing that we've done a lot through our leadership courses, where we can spend a whole day digging deep into it, we use something called the iceberg model, and it's sort of a sociological model to study culture, and it can be applied in many different situations, from a marriage and why the marriage isn't working to an entire nation of problems. And it pushes us from the visible things, the tip of the iceberg that we can see, and it helps us begin to explore below the surface the patterns, the structures, and then the basic assumptions or the mindsets and paradigms that actually underlie deeply underlie the source of the problem that we need to address. When we don't have time to do that, and we want somebody to, take a tool away, take something home that they can do right away, we'll pull up the 5 whys, and it's very simple. It's done in business. I've a business friend of mine put me onto it a few years ago, and so you start with a problem, whatever that might be, whatever's on your heart. I often use the problem of drug addiction, right? It's pretty prevalent almost in any community in the world. And it's stubborn. It's a difficult problem to address. It's complicated. So you say there's, a bunch of youth that are on drugs in our community. We want to do something about it. So start with stating the problem, and then the first why. They're all 5 are whys. So the first time you say why is, why are there these kids suffering with drug addiction? And you can brainstorm the answer. There's not just one right answer, right? It's complicated. So you can say, maybe it's because drugs are very available, or maybe the laws are too weak, or parents don't know what their kids are doing, or there's a really um, a drug dealer in the neighborhood that is really puts fear into people and is really good at selling, and so on. So that's the first why. So you get a list of those things. Then you pick one of them, because you can't do it with all. I mean, you can if you're really into this, but pick one of those streams, saying that one really interests me. The idea that parents don't know where their kids are. Okay, let's pick that one. So why don't parents know where their kids are? That's the why number 2. So then you go into, okay, here's several reasons. Uh, it's a working community, and both parents are at work all day long, maybe, or they're third generation people who don't have parenting skills. They were never taught, how to be a parent, or et cetera, right? You go brainstorming, and then you pick one of those and you say the third why, and so forth. Okay. You don't have to stop at 5 whys, but 5 usually gets you deep enough. And you start to create this picture. It might look like a tree, right? And with roots spreading out and branching out. And that picture starts to become the map of the problem. You see the complexity of the problem. So if you just, pass a law to say taking drugs or buying drugs or selling drugs is illegal, well, yeah, maybe that's one of the things. But there's workarounds, right? That doesn't solve the problem, because that's not the root of the problem. If we're going to look at addressing the real problem, we're going to have to say, how do we pick the key sort of central elements that are down around the 4th, 5th, 6th why level, and start to address those? Which brings us to another interesting situation. And this is why people don't want to go to this level, right? They just want to do a quick fix, is because that gets beyond your ability, probably individually, to do something about it and solve the problem, right? If I just put my head in the sand and give money to somebody who helps provide safe drugs to people or whatever, then I've done something. But when you get down to that complex level, wow, this is way beyond my ability to deal with this, and it's overwhelming. Where do I start? How do I make the choices of how to get involved in this? That is where, and if you listen to our previous podcast, and if you haven't, you should go back and listen to it, about the role of the catalyst. Why do we need catalytic leaders? Catalytic leaders work outside the box. They develop collaboration. They're natural at looking at all the different pieces that need to be working together in synergy to solve a problem. So now you've come down to a place where the problem is too complicated for any one person to address. But if we really care about the problem, we must address it at that level. So how are we going to do it? So we need ways to get all the different important elements talking to each other, working together, coordinating, so that we can address that. Right? And so you can see how people would want to avoid that, right? But what we're looking at and what we're trying to we're learning how to do and lead 555 is to help people, the input people, the helpers and the donors and the intellectual people who help us think through that, is how do we start to ask the right questions that can lead us to those answers. So it's really a toolbox. The five whys is a first step, right? You start to see the complexity of the problem more clearly. It doesn't give you the answers, but it's a step toward the answers.
Absolutely. I was thinking as you were talking, and again, it's funny how you can be around the same ideas for so long and then kind of just get fresh insight. Of course, one of the things we're doing at L5 is talking about kingdom communities, and we'll be talking more about that as time goes on, of course. But as a church leader, um, I recognize, and many of us recognize the issue of, and this will come in the next podcast as well. Everything's interrelated. But just the need for deeper community in our expressions of church, whatever that looks like. And as a leader, oftentimes that one leader will see the problem. If you're a pastor or you lead a large ministry or whatever, you can see the lack of community, you can see the lack of connection, and you want to change that. But as you just said, it's impossible to do that as one person. You can't be a close friend, a confidant, an accountability partner, to 100 people. It just doesn't work. And so many people, I think, see that, but then feel maybe that is impossible to fix. So we just keep getting together on Sunday mornings, and we just keep trying to be really friendly for that hour and a half. And the problem is just too big to tackle. But if we would just keep going deeper, and then, as you said, it's too big to tackle on your own. So you have to raise up other people who see the issue and are willing to tackle it. And of course, I've known that, I've been in that world, but I've never really, I don't know, maybe it's just fresh insight, and maybe it's just early in the morning. So everything seems so new to me because I'm just moving into the next day. But yeah, I think it's amazing to realize that, you know, we feel like it's so daunting. As a Christian leader, I feel like tackling the issue of loneliness is so daunting, but it's not an issue that I can tackle alone. There needs to be other people, and helping other people to see that and empowering them to be a part of the solution is huge.
Mm.
For me, that's probably one of the biggest issues I see today in the church world, is around just the lack of community, the loneliness, and of course perpetuated by the last few years. What about you? How do you feel? Like, do you think there's another huge issue in the church, just to help put practical examples in people's minds of some of the systemic issues we may face? Um, is there a systemic issue that you see in the church that kind of maybe keeps you up at night, that you think about, that could help people understand the concept of systemic problems?
Yeah. At the risk of dropping, big bombs on our listeners,
That's your job,
which
Mark.
we are known for doing that for sure. There's a tendency that you know, including myself, I've done this often throughout my life too, and I challenge myself on this. Is we think of us as the church or part of the church. Maybe you, as a listener, think the same way. You say, okay, what can we do to help the world? How can we get more missionaries out there to plant new churches and all of that, and do good and so forth. um, I've come to the conclusion, though, lately, that the biggest systemic problems, if we can divide them into two categories, there's systemic problems in the church and there's systemic problems in the world. Okay. And the whole missionary movement and everything is about, how do we from the church go into the world and preach the good news and so on. I believe that the biggest systemic problems we can tackle that will impact the world the most right now are actually in the church. It's not fixing the church so that it can do good out there. It's actually wrestling with the fundamental systemic issues in the church. And I do mean, this is where we step on toes. I do mean repurposing effort and funds that we use to go out to the ends of the earth and actually repurpose it to getting our act together. When the Apostle Paul, the great missionary of the New Testament, traveled all over the place, just phenomenal, commitment. It was messy. It was incredibly messy. But when he planted churches, his focus, and he had a whole team with him. He had, I don't know, a couple of dozen people, and he was training them and mentoring them, and they were going out. So there was a missionary movement there. But his focus with the churches wasn't to say, okay, you guys get set up, and when you're really strong, find somebody that can be a missionary among you and then send them out. That wasn't it. He didn't focus on the going out of the church. He focused on the quality. He focused on the character of the church. The issues he addresses in most of his letters, they're issues of character and understanding and the place and the lordship of Christ in the church and in their lives. That's what he focused on. And I think we need to get back to that today. We're actually planting churches around the world now, we're trying to, that are modeled after churches back home that have deep systemic problems. So this gets back to your earlier question, are we actually doing more harm than good? I think in some way we're doing more harm than good. Now, listen, I'm a missionary kid. I was born in Brazil. I'm proud of it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I come from a very sort of evangelical missionary background, and I loved it, and it was a blessing. Okay. I come from that. Okay. And God, wherever people act in faith and go out in faith and share the gospel in faith and obedience to Christ, God got us there. God blesses those people. But that doesn't mean that we don't ask the tough questions about where have we systemically gone wrong. Because I think the church in its current form, and it doesn't matter what stream of Christianity, whatever you're from, that's included in what I'm saying right now. My sort of evangelical background is as guilty as the Orthodox or the Pentecostals or the Catholics or any other stream that or name you can come up with. Okay, we're all basically in the same boat. We need to challenge the systems that exist in ourselves, and there's different sort of categories or sort of hooks you could use to start to sort of sift through those issues. But just for the real quickly in this blog, 3 of them would be the structures of church. What should those be? What do they look like? Are they anything like the early church? I'm not saying every church needs to look like the early church. But if we get down to the core of it, again, the root, we need to find out why did the early church not have structures the way we have it today? I don't think it was just cultural, but then later it became the thing. I think there was a reason and a pattern and a design to it. And so when we started to have challenges and saying, okay, we need to protect doctrine, we need to protect the church, by the 2nd century, and it probably started way back in the 1st century, but it became more and more evident by 2nd and 3rd century, we started to say, well, we need to be the protectors of doctrine. We need to be the protectors of the church and so on. So you start to get creeds and you start to get traditions and you start to get buildings and you start to get eventually ordination. Why ordination? Because it keeps people safe, right? And nowadays, I live in the country of Greece, and it's beautiful, and I love it. And there's many beautiful Christians in the Orthodox Church. But one of the things that happens, and it happens to varying degrees in any Christian tradition, including evangelicals, is we feel like, well, we don't know very much, but the professional paid clergy, they're the ones that really understand scripture. So let's let them interpret it for us. And so this whole move that we thought happened in the Reformation and affirming the priesthood of all believers, we sort of say that maybe, but we don't really mean it. What we do is we give up our ability to learn with the help of the Holy Spirit, and we give up the privilege of doing that to our pastors. And the way it translates even in the culture in the nation I'm living in right now is that the priests don't want you to read the scriptures directly. They want you to learn through them. So they get to interpret scripture the way they think it should be, and you need to listen to them. So the idea of putting scriptures in the hands of everybody is bad. The church thinks it's bad. Okay. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression, but it's looking at the systemic issues that affect us. So structure is one, leadership would be another one. I think we have deeply flawed models of church leadership and thinking around church leaders. And I'm not saying it's just the problem of the leader themselves. I think it's the people expecting leaders to be something that they weren't meant to be or shouldn't be. And so the people are just as guilty as the leaders of propping up structures. And the last I'll mention is these are very broad categories, is resources. In the early church, the giving in the church, it wasn't to the church. It was from the church to people in need. It was from the community to people in need. Nobody gave to the church. They gave to people in need. And yet, how many times have you heard? I mean, in my lifetime, I've heard it quite a few times. Well-intentioned pastors saying, you should really tithe first to the church, and then above that, you can give to other people, right? They protect this tithing thing. Why? Because a whole structure of dependency on buildings and paid clergy has required some form of taxation. So we've dug deep down into the Old Testament and brought forward a concept that wasn't meant to belong in the new covenant and said we need to do that. And so we have a whole structure around it, and we're gobbling up billions and billions and billions of dollars every year, maintaining a structure that was never meant to be. Those funds should be used in other ways to care for people. Okay, now that was a bit of a bomb. If we were accepting hate mail, I'm sure we'd get a lot right now. But I challenge you not to just disagree with me, but to go back to scripture, study scripture, and always go back to the source. Don't take my word for any of this. Don't take Taylor's word for any of it. Study prayerfully with all humility, study the word and ask these questions. So this is a digression, I agree, but systemic problems. The systemic problems that are biggest in the world are in the church, not out the church. So my last statement on that is this. You might say, oh, but we can't stop sending missionaries and planting churches and leading people to Christ. I mean, that is ultimate, isn't it? Isn't it? To get a lost soul saved, is that the most important thing? Okay. Well, that's certainly a big thing. Okay. Now we could have another theological argument about whether it's, a little piece of the big thing, but let's agree it is a big thing. I would say that if we actually address the systemic problems in the church, I'm not saying there's one easy answer or that the answers are all the same. Okay. I don't have all the answers, but I'm trying to ask the questions. So I agree that we want to save souls. But I truly believe that if we take the time to begin to deal with a type of renewal, I don't know what the right word is exactly, but a type of revival that's structural. It's not just individuals. It's almost like a corporate repentance. If we get to that point and start dealing with the systemic issues in the church at large, we are going to see a lot more souls saved. Okay, so it's not about saying souls aren't important. Let's just deal with inward issues in the church. I believe that the missionary agent, from a biblical perspective, the agent is the church. It's how we live with each other. We are the witness of Christ transforming us. But we've gone on to be very task oriented and sort of doing evangelism, doing mission, doing good out there, and forgotten that the very essence of it is the witness of being. And so that's my challenge there, is to look at the systemic issues in the church. Now, I don't want to discourage people. I'm not saying we should all do just that. Many of you have on your heart issues that you want to address down your street, across your city, across the world. Okay. Don't stop doing those things. But just learn to try to ask the questions that lead to the systemic level and try to repurpose your resources to address those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like I need to put a disclaimer here. Like when we talk about these things, it's one of those things where, your heart kind of goes, these are things and traditions that we've been upholding for entire lives. And so if you're listening and you're kind of all of a sudden you're thinking, I don't know about all this stuff, sit with it for a minute, think about it, bring it to God, go back to scripture. And some of these things are not even settled concepts in my heart. I'm still wrestling, and I'm sure, Mark, you too are wrestling and
Me
continuing to
too.
learn and grow. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a process. So don't if your back gets up, don't write off these ideas right away. But wrestle through them, and as Mark said, take them to God. Read the scriptures, and we're unpacking this too. So it's not something to run away from. I think as Mark so eloquently kind of unpacked the importance of it, these are things we need to be willing to ask and to tackle and to come to some conclusions on, because I think the gospel is worth it. I think the good news of Jesus and a life lived after him is worth
Absolutely.
more than our surface level um check marks or to-do lists. It requires us to go deeper. I have one more question for you, Mark, today. I've heard you or seen in your writing, you talk about anthills. Now, anthills, I'm a small town Newfoundlander, so I have not seen. Well, I have, but only because I've left Newfoundland. Anthills of the magnitude that some places in the world have seen. But yeah, share with us what you mean when you talk about the anthills. You talk about the queen ant, and give us a picture, because I'm expecting that if anyone from my area is listening, they have no idea what you're talking about. So share that idea with us.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting we're talking to you, Taylor, because you're one of the few people that um, I would know that can say occasionally you see an iceberg floating by your community.
Right.
And so that's radical. I mean, there's hardly anybody in the world that can say that. And Taylor has described it, and I think you've even taken a boat up to it, right?
Oh,
Yeah, which is a
absolutely.
bit of a yeah, it's a bit dangerous apparently the way you described it. But and so we use the iceberg model as I described earlier in the podcast. But if you're in a place like Africa, for example, they've read about icebergs, but it's sort of hard to imagine it, right? What's a lot easier to imagine is an anthill. Now, an anthill, it's another metaphor that does work to some degree. An anthill in Africa can be 2 or 3 meters high, like way above your head. And you can be in a field where you see dozens of anthills, and they're a nuisance because if you're trying to plant your crops and so on, and they take over space and eat things and so on. And so if you took one of your farm tractors and just sort of ran it over, right, just pushed it over with a front end loader or whatever. And you could raise it so and cultivate it, and it looks flat again, right? And the ants sort of scatter and whatever, they go wherever they go. Um, you come back a while later and they've rebuilt the anthill, and you're thinking like, well, we scattered the ants, like we killed a lot of them. Um, And what happened? Now, if you talk to an intelligent farmer in Africa, they'll say, well, yeah, you can do that, for years. You're never going to get rid of the ants. If you really want to get rid of that anthill, you have to dig down and find the queen ant. The queen ant is the heart and soul of that. And as long as there's a few other ants to serve the queen ant, they're going to rebuild. Okay. If you get the queen ant, you kill the anthill. If you get the queen ant. And so it's exactly what we're talking about. At the root of the surface things that we see and that we typically want to address is something at the core. And we've got to get to that. So even for those of you who've never seen an anthill of that size, I think you can picture it. You can go Google an anthill. You'll see what I'm talking about. You can use this statement. You can say for any issue, whether you're deciding on giving or supporting or befriending or praying for or becoming the leader of or launching a project, whatever endeavor it is that you might be setting out to do with the talents and gifts and resources that God has given you, ask this question: what is the queen ant that I am wrestling with? Have I found the queen ant? Or am I still playing around, knocking over the anthill? Okay. Um, ask that question. That one question will begin to revolutionize how you look at the world and how you help the world in a much more effective way.
That's fantastic. As you said that, I kind of got the imagery of kids playing in a sandbox. So many of us are just playing with the dirt of the anthill instead of getting to the root of the problem. We need to dig a little deeper. That's awesome, Mark. Thank you so much for walking us through what systemic change is, giving us some great illustrations of what that means. We will be back again in a couple of weeks with another podcast. We'll be talking about community. Now, this is something that gets me super excited, so I am very much looking forward to that. Make sure you tune in for that in a couple of weeks. And thanks again, Mark. As always, it's been a great time, and I'm still learning lots, so that's awesome.